I didn't make a scene. I didn't raise my voice. I just smiled, set the folder down on the dining room table, and said, "Call your lawyers. We'll talk tomorrow." The silence that followed was the sweetest thing I'd ever heard. Let me back up. I'm the youngest in my family, and by family, I mean the version that existed on paper and in holiday photos, but rarely in real life. My parents adopted me when I was 3 years old. They already had 2 biological children, my brother, who was 9 at the time, and my sister, who was 7. I don't remember much from before the adoption. I remember a social worker named Patricia who smelled like lavender and always wore the same gray cardigan. I remember sitting in a car with a pink backpack on my lap that had exactly 3 things inside it: a stuffed rabbit, a juice box, and a photo of a woman I no longer recognized. And then I remember my parents' house, the yellow front door, the smell of something baking, my mom, the woman who would become my mom, crouching down to my level in the entryway and saying, "We've been waiting for you." I believed her. For a long time, I believed all of it. My parents were good people. I want to make that clear before I say anything else, because this story is not about them being villains. It's about what happens when good people raise children who grow up deciding that love is a transaction and that some people in a family are simply worth less than others. My brother Nathan was 12 when he first said something that made my stomach drop. We were at a 4th of July barbecue at my aunt's house, and a neighbor asked him how many siblings he had. He paused. Actually paused. Then said, "1. My sister Renee." He didn't look at me when he said it. He was already looking somewhere else, reaching for a handful of chips, like the answer was the most casual thing in the world. I was 8 years old. I told myself I'd misheard. My sister Renee was more complicated. She wasn't cruel in the obvious cartoonish way. She was precise. She'd include me in conversations just enough that no adult could call her out, then pivot in some small, surgical way that reminded me exactly where I stood. When we were teenagers and she'd have friends over, she'd introduce me as the girl who lives here, not my sister. Not even Maya's daughter, which would have at least been something. Just the girl who lives here, with a little laugh that made her friends smile politely and move on. I used to replay those moments at night. I'd lie in bed and try to figure out what I'd done wrong, what I could fix, what I could say or be or become that would make them see me as real, as theirs, as enough. I never found the answer, because there wasn't one. The problem was never me. My parents saw it. I know they did, because my mom used to come into my room after those dinners and sit on the edge of my bed and hold my hand without saying much. She didn't make excuses for Nathan and Renee. She just sat there. And sometimes that was enough, and sometimes it wasn't. But it always meant something. My dad was quieter about it. He'd been raised in a family where feelings were managed privately, but he showed up in other ways. He taught me to drive. He came to every single one of my college visits, even the ones 3 hours away. He mailed me care packages my first year away that always included peanut butter crackers and exactly one terrible pun written on an index card. They weren't perfect parents, but they were mine, and I was theirs. That part was never in question, not to them. The problem was that Nathan and Renee were watching all of it, tallying, calculating. And somewhere along the way, they decided that love given to me was love taken from them. I graduated from college and moved back to my hometown for a job at a small nonprofit. My parents were aging. My dad had been diagnosed with early-stage heart disease, and my mom had started having trouble with her knees, and I wanted to be close. Nathan lived 40 minutes away and visited maybe twice a year. Renee had moved across the country for her husband's job and came back for Christmas if the flights were cheap. I was the one who took my dad to his cardiology appointments. I was the one who drove my mom to physical therapy every Tuesday and Thursday for 8 months. I was the one who made sure there was food in the house, that the medications were organized, that someone was actually there. I wasn't keeping score. I want to be clear about that too. I was doing it because they were my parents and I loved them, and this was just life. This was what you do. I didn't expect a reward. I didn't think about it in terms of payback. But Nathan and Renee were keeping score, just not for the same reasons I would have. My dad passed away first. It was a Tuesday in February, early in the morning. So early the sky was still that particular shade of dark blue that belongs only to the hours before anyone is really awake. I was with him. My mom was in the next chair, asleep. I held his hand when it happened, and I remember thinking that the room felt very still, and that I was grateful he hadn't been alone, and that I did not know yet how much harder everything was about to get. Nathan and Renee flew in for the funeral. They were gracious in public. They cried at the right moments. They accepted condolences with appropriate solemnity and said the right things about what a good man their father had been. Then, approximately 48 hours after we buried him, Renee pulled me aside in the kitchen while my mom was resting and said, "We need to talk about the house." I looked at her. "He's been gone for 2 days." She had the audacity to look slightly impatient. "I know, but there are things that need to be figured out. Nathan and I were talking, and we think it makes more sense for Mom to move into something smaller, and then we can figure out the property from there." I remember the specific feeling of that moment. Not anger, not yet. Just a kind of cold clarity, like watching something through glass. "She's not moving anywhere," I said. "She just lost her husband." Renee smiled the way she always smiled when she thought I was being naive. "We're just trying to be practical." I told her we could be practical later. She told me I didn't understand how these things worked. I told her I understood perfectly well, and then I went to check on my mom, and I did not speak to Renee again for the rest of their visit. They left on Sunday. My mom stood at the window and watched their rental car pull out of the driveway. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "Your father and I had a long conversation last year. I want you to know that." I didn't ask her to explain. I just stood next to her and put my arm around her shoulders, and we stood there watching the driveway long after the car was gone. My mom lived for another 2 years after my dad. They were good years in a lot of ways. Hard, yes, because grief doesn't really go away, it just reshapes itself. But we had time together that I will never stop being grateful for. We watched old movies. We went through photo albums. She told me stories about her own mother that I'd never heard before, about growing up in a small town in Ohio with 4 sisters and 1 bathroom and a father who worked at the plant and never missed a school play. She told me she'd always wanted a daughter who liked to sit and talk. She said she was glad she got me. I'm not going to tell you I didn't cry when she said that. She passed away on a Thursday morning in April. I was with her then, too. This time, the sky outside was pink and orange and completely unreasonable in its beauty. The kind of morning that feels like an insult when you're inside losing someone. And I thought she would have liked that sky. She always liked colors. The calls to Nathan and Renee were brief. They said the appropriate things. They said they'd be there as soon as they could. I won't describe the funeral in detail. I'll just say that it happened, and that it was dignified, and that my mom had specifically requested that we play a song by Nat King Cole and that there be peonies, and we did those things. And I was glad for something concrete to focus on. What happened 3 weeks later is the part that matters for this story. My parents' attorney, a man named Gerald, who had been their lawyer for 22 years and had the calm, measured presence of someone who had watched many families fall apart over money and no longer found it surprising, called me and asked me to come in. He said Nathan and Renee had already been in to meet with him and that I should come separately. I went on a Wednesday afternoon. The office smelled like old carpet and coffee. Gerald sat across from me with his hands folded on the desk and a folder in front of him that I recognized as the same kind of 2-pocket folder my dad had always used for important documents. Gerald said, "Your parents were very intentional about their wishes. They wanted to make sure there was no ambiguity." He slid the folder across the desk. I opened it. I am not going to walk you through every line of the will, partly out of privacy and partly because the specific numbers are not the point. The point is this: my parents had restructured their estate 4 years before my mom passed. Gerald told me later, when I asked, that they'd made the decision quietly without announcing it to anyone. They had watched. They had paid attention over many years to who showed up and who didn't, who called and who went silent, who was there for the appointments and the Tuesday and Thursday drives and the early mornings in February when the sky was still dark blue. They had left the house to me. They had left the majority of their financial estate to me. Nathan and Renee each received a specific and deliberate amount. Not nothing, because my parents were not cruel, but far, far less than they had clearly been expecting. And there was a letter, a separate document, in my dad's handwriting, addressed to all three of us, that Gerald had been instructed to give each of us individually. My copy said things I'm still not ready to repeat out loud. I will say that my dad wrote that love is not a genetic material. He wrote that family is a verb. He wrote that he and my mom had spent years watching their 3 children and that they had seen clearly which of us understood that. I sat in that office for a long time after I finished reading. Gerald gave me water. He was kind about it, in a very Gerald way, which meant he didn't say much, and refilled my glass twice without being asked. When I finally felt steady enough to ask, I said, "Do they know yet?" He said they had received their letters that morning. I thought about Nathan and Renee opening those envelopes. I thought about Renee, who had spent 25 years making me feel like a guest in my own family, learning that our parents had seen everything, had remembered everything, had made their decision based on exactly what they witnessed. I didn't feel triumphant. Not right away. What I felt mostly was grief, a different shape of it, a strange, complicated grief. For the family we could have been if Nathan and Renee had been different people, if some essential generosity had grown in them instead of whatever grew instead. But underneath that grief was something else, something quieter, a kind of settling, like a room finally going still after years of low, constant noise. My parents had seen me, they had always seen me, and in the end they had said so in the only permanent way they could. I got a call from Nathan 2 days later. He was not kind. He said things I won't repeat, not because I've forgotten them, but because they no longer have the weight they once would have. He said I had manipulated our parents. He said I had been there every day specifically to influence them. He said I was not actually their daughter, and that what they had done was unfair, and that his attorney was going to look into it. I let him finish. Then I said, "Nathan, I took Dad to 37 cardiology appointments. I drove Mom to physical therapy for 8 months. I was holding his hand when he died, and I was holding hers when she died, and I didn't do any of it for this. But I understand why you need to believe I did, because otherwise you'd have to think about what you did instead." He hung up. Renee sent a long email. I read it once and did not respond. Gerald had told me, gently and in his Gerald way, that the will was structured to be extremely difficult to contest. My parents had been thorough. They had worked with Gerald over 4 years to make sure of it. They had both been evaluated and found to be of full legal competence at the time of signing. There were no grounds. Nathan's attorney confirmed this some weeks later in a letter that said, "Essentially, there is nothing to pursue here." I stayed in the house. My parents' house. The yellow front door and the familiar rooms and the backyard where my dad had built a garden bed that still grew tomatoes every summer like it was the most natural thing in the world. I planted flowers that first spring, peonies, because my mom would have wanted them. I work at the nonprofit still. I have a good life. I have friends who are the kind of friends that feel like chosen family, the kind you don't explain but just have. People who show up with soup and bad television recommendations and a refusal to let you spiral alone. And last year, something happened that I didn't plan for, that I didn't see coming, that knocked the wind out of me in the best possible way. I started the foster process. I had thought about it for years, this vague, undefined pull that I'd never quite named. But after everything, after sitting in that house alone on the first Christmas, I finally made an appointment. I filled out the paperwork. I went to the training. I answered the questions honestly, including the ones about my own childhood, about what it feels like to be the child who wasn't blood, but was still, unmistakably, loved. 6 months ago, a little girl named Iris came to stay with me. She's 5. She has very serious opinions about which stuffed animals deserve top-shelf placement and which are floor animals. She carries her juice box like a briefcase. Last Tuesday, she asked me if I was going to be her mom. I told her I was trying very hard to be. She thought about this for a moment. She's a thinker, this one. And then she nodded like we had reached a satisfactory business agreement and went back to her coloring book. I stood in the kitchen doorway for a long time after that. I thought about a woman named Patricia in a gray cardigan. I thought about a pink backpack with 3 things inside it. I thought about a yellow front door and someone crouching down to my level and saying, "We've been waiting for you." I thought about my dad's handwriting on a piece of paper in a 2-pocket folder. Family is a verb. I'm doing my best to conjugate it correctly every single day. If you made it to the end of this, thank you for sitting with me in it. Some stories don't have clean edges. Some families are a shape you spend your whole life learning to describe. But what I know, what I'm certain of, the way you're certain of things you've earned rather than been told, is that belonging doesn't require biology. It requires showing up. It requires choosing again and again to stay. My parents knew that. They tried to teach it to all 3 of us. 2 of us weren't listening. I was. I thought a lot about what made Nathan and Renee the way they were. Not to excuse them. I stopped trying to do that a long time ago. But because I think there's something worth understanding in it. Something that goes beyond this one family and this one story. They grew up believing that love was a fixed resource. That if my parents gave some to me, there would be less for them. That belonging was a competition with a winner and a loser. And so they spent decades protecting what they thought was theirs, not realizing that what they were actually doing was shrinking. Every time Renee introduced me as the girl who lives here, she wasn't diminishing me. She was diminishing herself. Every time Nathan looked past me at a family gathering, he was practicing a kind of smallness that would eventually cost him everything he thought he was protecting. That's the thing about how we treat people when no one important is watching. We think we're getting away with something. We think the only record being kept is the one we're aware of. But people notice, the quiet ones especially. My parents noticed. For years and years they noticed. Who showed up? Who disappeared? Who called when it was inconvenient? Who went silent when things got hard? They didn't make a show of it. They didn't threaten or lecture. They just watched and remembered, and eventually, in the only permanent way available to them, they said what they saw. That's not luck. That's not fate in any mystical sense. That's just the very slow, very patient arithmetic of a life lived in full view of the people who love you. You are always being known by someone. The question is only what they're coming to know. I think about my own life now. About the Tuesday drives and the cardiology appointments and the terrible pun index cards, and I don't see sacrifice. I see the person I was becoming through those choices. I was learning, without knowing I was learning it, that showing up is not a grand gesture. It's a habit. It's a decision you make so many times it stops feeling like a decision and just becomes who you are. And who you are is what you leave behind. Not in the legal sense, not necessarily in a will or a property transfer, but in the shape of the space you occupied in someone else's life. Iris doesn't know any of this yet. She's 5. She has a stuffed rabbit she carries everywhere, which I noticed immediately because I once had one too. I'm not going to tell her that for a while. Some parallels are better discovered than announced. But I'm going to keep showing up for her every ordinary Tuesday, every inconvenient morning, every moment when it would be easier to be somewhere else. Not because I expect anything in return, because that's what my parents taught me. Not in words, in 37 cardiology appointments, in Thursday physical therapy drives, in sitting on the edge of a bed and holding a hand without needing to say anything at all. The inheritance I actually care about is that. The knowledge that love is not a noun you possess, it's a verb you practice. And if you practice it long enough, consistently enough, honestly enough, it changes you. It builds something in you that nobody can contest in a lawyer's office. Nathan can keep whatever he thinks he lost. I'm busy conjugating.